Grace and peace to you from the one who was and is to come. Amen. To read the Bible is to be confronted with the full range of human experiences. We are made aware of what people are capable of, at both their best and their worst. And all of this is placed within the context of a relationship with a Creator God who is the source of all life and love. When one enters the Bible's narrative world, one should not expect to encounter an ideal world. In fact, this holy book does not shy away from addressing violence openly and depicting it in a dramatic manner. The Bible witnesses in particular to the violence inflicted on women. We encounter such violence against women in stories as, for example, the rape of Tamar, of Dinah, of one nameless woman, and of many women in war. But also in texts where it becomes clear that women's lives count for less than men's. And then there are biblical passages in which women are robbed of their subjectivity. Note, for example, that in the Old Testament there is only one woman of which we are explicitly told that she loves a man. It is Michal, the daughter of Saul, who is said to be in love with David. Otherwise, women are mostly reduced to mere objects. In one of the 10 Commandments, they are listed among the man's possessions, together with the slaves and cattle. The fact that the New Testament lacks similarly violent narratives should not be interpreted as evidence of a greater humanity or higher quality of relationship between women and men compared to the Old Testament. It is rather a matter of different literary genres. We know that the New Testament period was just as patriarchal in nature. In fact, at times, New Testament texts clearly reinforce patriarchal attitudes. For example, in 1 Timothy chapter 2, the subordination of women to men is justified with Genesis chapter 2, thereby imposing a patriarchal mindset onto the Old Testament passage. With a similar patriarchal mindset, Adam is understood not as human being or earthling, as in Genesis 2, but contrary to the Hebrew meaning of the word, as man. It is important to recognize the prevalence of patriarchy in both the Old and New Testament in order to counter the idea of the supposed superiority of Christian ethics over Jewish ethics. And the Jesus who challenged patriarchal norms was a Jew who was inspired by what we call the Old Testament to envision a community of equals living together in peace. The Old Testament was just as much the Bible for Jesus and the early Christians as it was for Jews. And the Old Testament narratives, which deal with direct, primarily sexual violence against women, were by no means written or understood as normative texts. These texts of terror, as the exegete Phyllis Tribble calls them, caused hardly less horror among the first readers than among contemporary readers. The fact that biblical texts, especially those from the Old Testament, testify to violence against women does not mean that they approve of it. They are as much an expression of horror as they are a protest against sexualized violence and a testimony to the attempt to overcome it. The downplaying or concealment of these harsh and violent texts which are barely mentioned in sermons and religious books, has led to people who discover them to reject the entire Bible. The Old Testament in particular reports with unsparing realism on the reality of violence against women. Sexualized violence is woven into unequal power relations and structures of domination. As shocking as these texts are, they do not further degrade women by concealing the violence. Even when men appear to have the last word in the narrative by demanding to keep the crime secret, as Absalom does to Tamar, who has been raped by her half-brother, the narrative itself does not give the actors, but rather the reader, the last word. In that way, the story summons us to not remain silent, repress, or forget. Or think of Jephthah's daughter, who is sacrificed because her father values the fulfillment of his vows more than the life of his daughter. While Isaac was rescued from his father's intention to sacrifice him, there is no angel coming to rescue her. But at least the narrative preserves the memory of this cruel and selfish act of male domination over women. And the story ends with a group of women dedicated to remember Jephthah's daughter every year. A later tradition gives the daughter, who is nameless in the Bible, a name, Sheila, and thus an identity and memory beyond her violent death. The story is found in the book of Judges, as is the story of the horrific rape and dismemberment of a woman who becomes an object of power for several men. We witness an escalation of violence, which pinpoints the times of the Judges as one of lawlessness. The book concludes with stating that everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It is against this background of lawlessness that we can appreciate the attempt of biblical lawgivers to prevent such violence. Deuteronomy chapter 22, for example, equates rape with murder, even if the victim survives physically. The importance of upholding the law in view of these acts of violence is evident in the Old Testament. A good example is the way the absolute power of fathers is challenged within the private sphere of the family. Marital rape is no longer exempted from public judgment. No one in no sphere is any longer above the law. The family is no longer a lawless space. This also applies to the sexual abuse of children, which is predominantly committed within the family. But among the most disturbing biblical texts are those in which God himself is associated with sexual violence against women. I'm talking about those passages from the prophets, where cities and countries are being personified as unfaithful or rebellious wives who are punished by a God portrayed as a jealous and angry husband. The book of Revelation also speaks, for example, of the whore of Babylon, in order to refer to Rome. And even though those cities and countries are not real women as such, God's punishment is portrayed as an act of violence against women, and such violence forms the real background for these metaphors. Theologians therefore rightly argue, as long as women are raped, as long as rape of women is part of war, as every rape is less a form of sexuality than a demonstration of power, the reference to metaphor cannot eliminate the real core of violence in such perspectives. And if we agree that the Bible has been written and put together mainly by men, then we would need to examine the motives for presenting God as such a jealous and violent husband. Some talk about these texts of terror as resistant texts because they summon us to deal with our religion in a more self-critical way and learn how to credibly represent the healing potential of the more liberating and restoring aspects of our Bible. To what extent can the violent crimes recounted in the Bible help us to understand the systemic aspects of sexual violence? Are some of the patterns in biblical texts not familiar from contemporary research of violence against women and children? Think about the intertwining of power, domination, and sexuality, and how structures of domination are woven into sexualized violence. The complexity of the biblical discourse on sexualized violence corresponds to the fact that sexualized violence is still a complex phenomenon today and must be considered in its intersectionality with gender, sexual orientation, social status, religion, origin, age, and education. How can the analysis of biblical texts help to reveal the connection between the construction of masculinity and violent behavior? And should the discussion of these texts of terror not help to give voice to those who are usually silenced? After all, the code of silence is still part of the systems of sexualized violence today, especially where perpetrators and victims belong to an overarching social context that is actually viewed positively: family, neighborhood, church, sports club. Loyalty to the greater whole often makes it even more difficult to put the violence experienced into words and bring it to public attention. One would hope that reading and analyzing biblical texts that speak of violent crimes can give voice to the pain of those affected by it today. Reading these texts should help to counteract repression, avoidance, concealment, and forgetting, and lead to the crimes being named and the perpetrators being charged. And was this not possibly also the original intention of including such violent texts in the Bible, to process experienced violence? The Old Testament originated in a historical context marked by war, conquest, flight, migration, and deportations. Biblical texts are therefore now also studied and analyzed as evidence of collective trauma and as a means of processing and overcoming trauma by beginning to put the horrific experiences into words and reflect on them theologically. Violence is addressed and exposed rather than being suppressed or swept under the carpet. Readers are summoned to confront the overt and covert violence present in our societies and come to terms with our own propensity for violence.
Sometimes I feel discouraged and think my work's in vain, but then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul.
In some biblical stories, it is the fear and hatred of the stranger which is connected to sexual violence. The biblical account of Lot's daughters exemplifies this and also reveals the abuse of power based in patriarchy. I'm following the interpretation of the feminist scholar and pastor Margot Käßmann. The story can be found in Genesis chapter 19. The two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. "My lords," he said, "please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night, and then go on your way early in the morning." "No," they answered, "we will spend the night in the square." But he insisted so strongly that they did go with him and entered his house. He prepared a meal for them, baking bread without yeast, and they ate. Before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us. so that we can have sex with them. Lot went outside to meet them and shut the door behind him and said, "No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof." "Get out of our way," they replied. "This fellow came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play the judge. We'll treat you worse than them." They kept bringing pressure on Lot and moved forward to break down the door. But the men inside reached out and pulled Lot back into the house and shut the door. Then they struck the men who were at the door of the house, young and old, with blindness, so that they could not find the door. We do not know the name of Lot's daughters. They share such anonymity with many women in the Bible who are reduced to being daughters or wives of a father or husband mentioned by name. But names represent identity and affirm dignity. Let's give the 2 daughters of Lot a name and call them Naomi and Deborah. The 2 young women share a horrific experience. Their father Lot has invited 2 strangers who have come to visit Sodom to stay at his home. The biblical narrator tells us that they are angels, messengers of God. Father Lot wants to be hospitable, but suddenly there is a mob of young and old men appearing outside of his house. The bellowing crowd demands from Lot to hand over those 2 guests. They are set to rape them. What is going on here? We are not given any reasons for their intentions. What kind of rumor will have incited the crowd? What we need to emphasize is that Sodom's depravity is sexual violence, which should not be confused with homosexuality. To abuse the story as a weapon against queer people is in itself a form of violence. Rape is sexual intercourse without mutual consent and respect. It is forcefully or violently committed in a violation and torture of both body and mind. Or to speak with Alan's story, rape turns the wonder of love into a weapon of war. Rape turns what is beautiful into something brutal. Rape turns what is an act of vulnerability into an act of violence. Rape turns what should be an act of equality, mutuality, and pleasure into an act of dominance, selfishness, and power. Rape is not about sex per se, it is about power and domination. The people in Lot's house will have been frightened. What is Lot supposed to do? Hospitality is sacred to him, and it includes the responsibility to ensure the safety of one's guests. In the end, Lot decides to hand over his 2 daughters to the mob in place of the 2 guests. He refers to his daughters as being untouched, and later we read that there are already 2 son-in-laws who were pledged to marry Lot's daughters. This indicates that the daughters might have been about 12 years old. What is being described in this biblical passage is an inconceivable and brutal scene. What will it have been like for these 2 young women? Lot himself has come to the city of Sodom as a stranger, and even though his wife is a local, the family as a whole will have been considered newcomers. When he stands up for his guests, we hear the mob shouting, "This fellow came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play the judge." But why would Lot have been willing to hand over his daughters in place of the guests? Male biblical scholars have tried to explain that hospitality was regarded as more important than the protection of one's children. Others have argued that Lot tried to simply show that the Sodomites were not as bad as their reputation, and that he was certain they would not accept his offer. It was only when women interpreters of the Bible were fully heard that Lot's offer was seen to be outrageous. Indeed, how can a father not protect his daughters? It is a miracle that Lot makes it back into the house and is able to barricade himself and his family. No one is raped, but the shock remains. The daughters' image of their father will have been profoundly shaken. But the story does not stop there. We read about how these messengers of God announced the destruction of Sodom and urged Lot, his wife, and their daughters to flee. And when Lot's wife cannot resist looking back, she turns into a pillar of salt. Lot and his daughters, on the other hand, finally manage to settle in the mountains and find refuge in a cave. It is at this point that the story once again takes a terrible turn. One day the older daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there's no man around here to give us children, as is the custom all over the earth. Let's go get our father to drink wine and then sleep with him and preserve our family line through our father." That night they got their father to drink wine, and the older daughter went in and slept with him. He was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. The next day the older daughter said to the younger, "Last night I slept with my father. Let's get him to drink wine again tonight, and you go in and sleep with him so that we can preserve our family line through our father." So they got their father to drink wine that night also, and the younger daughter went in and slept with him. Again, he was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. So both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab. He's the father of the Moabites of today. The younger daughter also had a son, and she named him Ben-Ami. He's the father of the Ammonites of today. According to the biblical narrator, both Naomi and Deborah get their father drunk in order to sleep with him. The two sons born to them, Moab and Ben-Ami, are children of incest and said to be the progenitors of the Moabites and Ammonites, two tribes considered enemies of Israel. Some suspect that this scandalous tale of origin is meant to justify such animosity and humiliate the enemies. But a reality check is needed. Let's picture Naomi and Deborah for a moment, two 11 or 12-year-old girls. Would a 12-year-old girl come up with the idea of being impregnated by her father? The story smacks of fabrication, along the lines of the daughter has seduced the father, it is not his fault. This is nothing new. Shame and guilt are always attached to the victims and survivors of rape rather than the perpetrators. And it is the narrative of blame that usually follows the rape survivors. They are held responsible for the crime that has been committed against them. Naomi and Deborah are bound together by a story of suffering. They grow up in surroundings in which they feel like strangers. Their mother comes from Sodom and will have felt at home. But their father is also a stranger in town, and the two daughters might have felt a strong connection to him, a stronger one to him than to their mother. More recent interpretations of the story wonder if we are not confronted with a classic example of abuse. The father binds the daughters to himself. They form a close-knit community. He clearly demonstrates the power he has over their lives. How can he offer his two untouched daughters to the angry mob? They might very well not have been married, but what if the father has already touched and disgraced them? The mother seems excluded from this threefold alliance. She longs to be back in Sodom and turns into a pillar of salt. Now the girls are completely at the father's mercy. Incest was also in those times a taboo. This is why the narrator wants to make us believe that the daughters seduced their poor drunk father in order to have children from him. And in this way they become victims of first their father and then of a society that does not believe them and blames them for the incest. It is this experience that many survivors of abuse make today. The only comfort we are left with as readers is that the two sisters will have had each other. At least they can talk to each other and find words to come to terms with the horror they have experienced. The #MeToo debate has once again revealed how girls and women remain silent because they are afraid to be intimidated. We know from survivors of abuse that there are always those who do not believe them. And so they withdraw and fall into depression. Naomi and Deborah are threefold survivors. First, their father is willing to hand them over to the mob to be gang raped. Then he abuses them himself. And finally, the biblical narrator casts them as perpetrators. This has inspired artists like Bruegel or Tintoretto to paint those two daughters as topless seductresses, getting their father drunk with wine. This biblical story will be very hard to bear for survivors of abuse and sexual violence. But stories like these can also open up possibilities to speak more openly, not only about experiences of sexual violence, but also how certain interpretations of the Bible have perpetuated a patriarchal society which continues to sanction the abuse of women by men. Some of the priority interventions identified by experts to counter gender-based violence in South Africa resonate with aspects of our biblical story. Firstly, we have to start early with young children and teenagers to talk about gender identity, attitudes and norms, for they are largely set by the mid-teens. How did Lord come to think of his daughters as a possession over which he has absolute power? Do certain biblical interpretations perpetuate the sense of male superiority? Secondly, we have to support national and local efforts to prevent heavy drinking. Gender-based violence and femicide are strongly associated with heavy drinking. Critical actions are to limit liquor trading hours. In our biblical story, it is alcohol that is said to have led to Lord losing all inhibitions. And thirdly, we have to confront the failure of the policing and justice systems and increase the support of survivors. As biblical interpreters, we cannot let Lord get off the hook and blame the survivors of sexual violence for the incest. As interpreters, we cannot abdicate our responsibility to be suspicious of texts that cast the perpetrator as the victim. The biblical stories about sexual violence should therefore be read and understood as a memorial and a reminder of suffering, as a cry from those affected against silence and repression, with the aim of radically punishing the crime and bringing about a radical change in gender relations, away from an unequal power balance and towards equal opportunities for all without violence. And on this hard and long journey to freedom, deep peace of the rolling waves to you, deep peace of the flowing air to you, deep peace of the shining stars to you, deep peace of the quiet earth to you, and deep peace of the Son of Peace to you. Amen.
If you can preach like Peter, if you can preach like Paul, go home and tell your neighbor he died to save us all. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul.